All right, good morning or good evening to everybody. My name is Dr. Avriel Licciardi, and welcome to this month's webinar, which is part of the LetPub webinar series. I just want to check that everyone can see my video and also hear me clearly. If you can say yes in the chat, that would be great. All right, it looks like we're good to go. Again, I want to thank you all for joining me and my co-host, Dr. Clark Holdsworth, today for this webinar on how to transform your manuscript into an engaging scientific talk or research presentation. And before we move forward with the content for today, I do just want to highlight some of the features that we have as part of this webinar. We are using Zoom, which allows us not only the great chat function, which many of you have already discovered. This function allows you to chat with the attendees throughout the entire presentation today. You guys can network within the chat room as well. If there are any technical difficulties, my co-host Clark will be monitoring the chat, so please let him know if there's any issue with audio or video throughout the presentation, and we'll deal with it in real time. The other excellent function of Zoom is the Q&A function, or the question and answer function. If you have any questions related to the presentation content, which we strongly encourage, we're more than happy to answer any and all of your questions. Please insert those questions into the Q&A function. And other fellow attendees may actually have the same question as you. So if you notice that a fellow attendee has already asked a question that you're interested in, all you need to do is simply upvote that question, and the questions with the highest number of upvotes at the end of the presentation will be at the top of our list for questions to answer. So again, we welcome questions, and please put them in the Q&A function and not put them in the chat room, which you guys are using right now. We also have another very exciting portion of our talk today, which is our new sponsor. And Dr. Clark Holdsworth is going to give us a little bit of a brief introduction about our sponsor, which is Hindawi.
Hey, V, thanks. Glad we're having another timely conversation for this month. Yeah, to start off, we have a new sponsor, Hindawi, for this webinar series overall, which is going to help us a lot in terms of being able to expand it as our user base grows. We have what are we looking at? Over 200 participants here today. So our ability to provide you with the on-demand access is really dependent on our sponsors. So we want to thank Hindawi. If you are looking for journals, Hindawi has over 200 scientific journals. Check out hindawi.com. They have a new website launched just in the last couple months or so, and it makes it quite easy to look through their selection of journals and get your basic information like impact factor, acceptance rate, this type of thing, which not a lot of journals do. So their transparency makes it easy to select. So definitely go ahead, give them a visit if you enjoy the webinar here today, because as a sponsor, they do make this possible. As I mentioned, because of them, we're able to do on demand through Zoom and make these recordings available to you on the cloud. So what's going to happen here today is after the webinar is finished, you'll be able to access it on demand. Zoom is going to send you an automated follow-up email. Within that email, we always place the link to the shared open webinar for you to view afterwards on demand. You're free to share that with colleagues, classmates, whoever it may be. So just give about 24 hours, that automated email will come. It'll have the recording for you. It won't have the slides, so keep in mind it'll just be this recording in its entirety. Additionally, you're going to have the webinar certificate that's going to be available. So if you do require that for continuing education credits or anything like that, you will get a webinar certificate with the webinar date and title on it. So yeah, we can move ahead with the convo, AV.
All right. If you've been with us before, we do like to just very briefly introduce ourselves in case there is anyone new in the audience. And again, these are monthly webinars. So if you like the content that we present today, please be sure to join us next month and the months thereafter. Again, my name is Dr. Avriel Licciardi. I'm an associate editor with LetPub. Prior to jumping into the publishing world, I got my master's in geology at the University of New Hampshire, where I studied glaciers in both Peru and Chile. And then I moved up north in terms of my research, looking at glaciers in Greenland when I did my PhD in the geological sciences at the University at Buffalo.
Yeah, and I'm Dr. Clark Holdsworth. I'm the Research Communications Manager at LetPub. I know a lot of you are returning users or viewers, so you've seen this before, but I received my doctorate in physiology from Kansas State University, where I studied the O2 gradients down from ambient air all the way to the very low O2 tensions in muscle myoglobin, particularly in states of dysfunction like chronic congestive heart failure.
All right, and I think Dr. Holdsworth is going to join the chat now, and I'll just briefly review the content that we're going to be getting into today. So
Yes.
Today's topic is giving a great scientific presentation. So this is something that researchers, no matter of their discipline, are probably going to encounter sometime in their career. And there are different types of scientific presentations. Of course, one is the manuscript, another is a poster at a conference, and then there is the scientific talk, which can be one of the most daunting presentations for many people. So the beginning of the presentation today is going to be discussing the main differences between a manuscript versus a scientific talk. And this is a big part of how you frame your talk to make it more effective and engaging for your audience. The bulk of the presentation will be kind of divided into two sections. One will be about the content of your scientific talk, how to make it effective for the viewers that you're presenting to, what to include on your slides, what to not include on your slides, basically the do's and don'ts of a presentation, and how to take that manuscript and find the most important parts that you want to highlight. The second part will be about you. You are the presenter of the scientific talk. What can you do to make your presentation more exciting for the viewers, more engaging, and importantly, not lose the attention of your audience through your talk, which can range, anywhere from 5 minutes to probably 45 minutes or an hour for a dissertation defense. And after I get through that content, Clark is going to jump back into the presentation with some insider tips for virtual scientific talks. And at LetPub, we do try to be, timely and with the content that we deliver to you as our attendees. And, given what we're facing as a world right now, it's important to address how to give, the best virtual scientific talk that you can provide, because that may be something that you're encountering right now. And then finally, as always with our webinars, we will have an active Q&A session where Clark and I will answer any questions regarding the presentation content today in real time at the end. So again, we encourage you to add questions to the Q&A throughout the presentation, or upvote questions that you would also like to see an answer to at the end of the presentation today. So with that, a scientific presentation or a talk is a professional way to share any of your research observations, introduce hypotheses, and demonstrate and interpret the results of a study. And in addition to that, it's also important to always summarize what you've learned or what you and your colleagues have learned and the future work that you're going to be doing on that specific subject. So it's simply a form of active communication. And as research scientists, presentations are essential for a lot of components that will ultimately, help your career trajectory towards success. And I've listed 5 here. Importantly, presentations are important for sharing your research and by extension also promoting your research. And by doing that, you also gain recognition in your field. Talks are a little bit more flashy, if you will, than perhaps a scientific poster, mainly because you're getting up in front of an audience and highlighting the most important findings of your research. If you are an early career scientist or perhaps a graduate student, presentations are also very important for attracting colleagues, basically getting your research out there and potentially finding someone that you're going to work with in the future. And if you're a professor, giving presentations is also how you're going to attract students. You want to have your talks be enticing for finding individuals that want to work with you. Presentations are also appealing to potential and current funders. This is especially important in the medical field. And of course, scientific talks help educate your peers, whether that's through conferences or perhaps a maybe more low-key departmental talk, as well as the public. A big question is, what's the difference between a talk and a paper? So as researchers, we spend a lot of our time developing our manuscripts and working towards getting published, which is a whole different set of, general standard instructions about how we can go about being most successful in publishing. But there are a lot of differences between a talk and a paper. You cannot simply just cut and paste the abstract of your manuscript onto a slide and call it good. So importantly, manuscripts provide all or most of the details of your research, and talks really only present the highlights or one core message. Generally, talks also target a much wider audience, and as such, they need a broader context than you probably provide in your introduction in your paper. Papers often target a more specialized group, people that are directly within your discipline or field. An exception to this is, of course, a review paper. Both talks and papers use visual aids, manuscripts use figures, and as do talks, but in talks, authors have to often change or manipulate their visuals for scientific talks. For example, you might have a figure that has 4 separate panels, but if you're only going to talk about one panel, then you need to extract that one panel and make that the center of your slide in your talk. Another important thing to consider is that a manuscript is a published form of communication. You've probably already had the majority of your discussion and the reviewer comments and everything like that, the criticisms that might come through, that's all before your manuscript is published, with the exception of post-publication review, which is now emerging a little bit more in the society. With a talk, their questions are going to come after your presentation, and the discussion that you might receive will continue, perhaps with days and hopefully with weeks and months as you generate colleagues. And a similarity between manuscripts and talks is that it is still important to not embellish your work or present unsupported conclusions in a research talk. And I say this because when you want to give a talk, you want to be engaging, you want to have some flair to your presentation, and it's a little bit tempting sometimes to stretch your conclusions a little bit too far. But again, your findings are going to be exciting enough, especially if you set the stage early on in your talk, which we'll talk about today. So the first part of this presentation is, again, about the content. So this is the slides and how you're going to present what's on those slides and what's important in terms of developing an engaging scientific presentation. First and foremost, it is important to know not only your goals, but also who you're talking to, so the audience. You must gear your talk to both the knowledge level and the needs of the audience. So are you talking to people that are highly specialized in your field? Or are you talking to the public, or maybe your department peers, which range in a variety of disciplines or even fields of research? So it's very important to know your audience and then target your slides to them. If you have a specialized audience, that audience may really want to know the details of your study. How did you address your research questions? What specific methodology did you use? What analyses did you use, and what do they say about your research? In contrast, a general audience is probably not going to want to know the ins and outs of your methodology because that's going to be too much detail. And if it's an audience that doesn't understand that detail, you're unfortunately going to lose their interest and they'll stop paying attention. That's why it's important to really know your audience. And one way that you can identify, or get clues into what your audience may be is really to either ask people that have already been to a conference that you're going to be presenting at what the audience is going to be like. Or if you are invited to speak at a department, you should definitely invite that person or ask that person who invited you to speak what the audience will be like. And this is really, an important step in setting up an effective talk, because this knowledge will help you identify what's going to be of most interest to your audience, and then you kind of cater your talk specifically to that audience. Another important component is to clarify the importance of your work up front. And this is something that's pretty similar when you talk about proposals as well as manuscripts, but for a talk, you really want to have a central message. And a good way to start thinking about this are a few questions. The first one is, what are the take-home points that you want your audience to be leaving with? What is the main message that you want to instill upon them? Another good question is, what problem is your work going to help solve? And specifically, how does your work benefit the audience that you're talking to? So a good tip here is don't assume that your audience knows your field. Again, provide broad context and then specifically highlight why your work fits into that broad context and what question it's going to solve. In other words, if the audience doesn't understand each word you use, again, they're going to stop paying attention. I know it can be scary being like, oh my gosh, I'm not going to remember everything that I need to say. So you can, of course, incorporate text on slides, just as we're doing in this presentation today. And it's important to place only the most important phrases, not big blocks of complete sentence text on the slides in large font. This will help you that if you forget to say something really important, the audience will be able to read this right on your slide and still get that main message, even if you can't quite articulate your message clearly. And if you have done sort of any research into preparing for a talk, you've probably heard the phrase that a talk should tell a scientific story, or it should follow a story arc. And this is true. You may have, 12 to 15 minutes for a conference presentation, and within that time, you want to, provide this story arc for your audience, and it will be a succinct story. So there are kind of 4 main sections that you should make sure to include in every talk that you give. The first part is the introduction or the context. Again, you want to cite previous research as well as yours if available that's brought you to this point in your research, and then identify where your work fits in. And then from there, you need to make it very clear. You need to state the problem, motivate the motivation to solve that problem, and why the audience should be interested. Again, this is a universal suggestion for everyone drafting scientific talks. The next part is you will have to tell your audience how you did your research, and this will be your methods. And methods is where a lot of us get bogged down, because we're, the ones that have been out doing the field work for weeks, or we've been in the lab for months. So you're very comfortable with the ins and outs of your methods, and therefore you spend a lot of time talking about that. Unfortunately, methods are often the thing that you should not be talking about as much in your scientific talk, because it's where you can lose those general audience members. You should keep the methods simple and sweet. And if an audience member in your discipline has a question specifically about a method, you can always elaborate that with a question later. The next part of your talk will be the results. Importantly, you want to also stray away from nitty-gritty details here. You want to provide the main highlights of your selected results. Again, you want to include the most salient details, and you also want to present your highlights in a logical order. If you need analysis A to generate analysis B or data B, then you obviously need to present A before B and not the other way around. And then lastly, you always want to end your talk with a conclusions or a summary slide, which simply condenses your results and the implications of your findings. We recommend bullets or outline form is best, and this should really only be 3 to 4 points. Again, you do not want a slide that's full of text where your audience members are reading the text and not listening to you. This is also where you should indicate your future work, so that would be 1 of your 3 or 4 bullets. And it's also important to always thank the audience and acknowledge your collaborators, funders, and mentors as part of your conclusion or summary slide. And regarding the content, as you've probably kind of heard me hinting at, is that it's really important to keep it simple. And this is probably the hardest thing going from a manuscript to a talk, because your manuscript is so detailed, and also to get published, you had to focus on so many details about, adhering to the journal's guidelines. But again, for talks, do not include too much material. You need to identify that main message and focus your talk around only 1 or 2 central points. It's important also to avoid excessive jargon or acronyms. So these are terms that are very specific to your research field. Again, your audience will lose interest if they do not understand a term that you're using. If a term is absolutely essential to your work, it's okay to have that term in your talk, but all you need to do is add a brief definition of that terminology or of a process that you're using. And a good way to do this is add that definition right onto your slide for your audience members. You want to, as a general note, keep the text in your slides to a minimum. You want to be talking more verbally than you do just want to be reading text off slides. It's also important not to use many special effects or crazy slide transitions, as this can be very distracting to audience members. And if you are in a heavily mathematical discipline, unless you're talking to other members within your specific field that are going to be very interested in these equations that you have and that you've been working on, I recommend not showing complex equations on slides. Many people won't understand them if it's general, or alternatively, people will stop listening to what you're actually saying and they'll just start studying the equation that's on the slide. And as a general note, when you have a presentation, Each main slide should take only about 1 or 2 minutes to explain. So if you're on the slide for much longer than that, that probably means you have too much text on your slide, or you need to, add a visual component. And very importantly, you need to polish your visuals. And I say polish because that often means change your visuals from your manuscript to be a little bit different for your talk. As scientists, many of us have plots and graphs that have figures and that have axes. Please use large letters for your figures. No font smaller than 16 point. And for reference, 16-point font is on this slide. It's the smaller font that I have in the sub-bullets of this presentation. It's also important to keep your graphics simple. So if you don't show any plots you don't need, and don't crowd the slides. So again, the example I used previously, if you have a multi-panel figure, but you only need to explain one of those panels to get your point across in your scientific talk, only have that one panel shown as part of your slide. There's no need to show the other 3. It's also important to use color as it's engaging for the audience, but again, be mindful about this. Too much color can be very distracting. If there are color impaired individuals in your audience, red and greens are not as advisable. And again, strong contrast is preferred, so dark font on a light background. Schematics are also helpful if you're explaining very complicated concepts. Breaking it down, thinking about how the public can understand your research is a good way to also put that in your scientific talk. Scientists appreciate very simple schematics and figures within talks. Again, you're trying to get across a lot of research in a short amount of time, so making it simple to understand is key. And then, just like a manuscript, you want to use consistent fonts and style throughout the presentation to have a polished final look. So I've given you a lot of detail here about the content of research presentations, but I do want to show you some examples about what not to do, specifically about how to make your slides, things in slides that you do want to avoid. So right here, I have an example. This slide, number 1, has way too much text on it. There's full sentences here, and it's also very hard to read because the font is over a picture. In general, it's not advised to put a picture as a background. Number 1, it's distracting. Number 2, you can't really see the picture, and you can't read the font. So again, avoid too much text on slides and avoid photos as main backgrounds. Regarding font, if you read the slide here, it kind of says it all. You want to make sure that you use a font color that doesn't contrast with the background color, because again, it's hard for people to read. If you change the color of certain words and sentences, it can be distracting. Same thing with bullets and sub-bullets. And while, it's good to be creative as a scientist, and I think that's an essential skill, going a little bit above and beyond can be a little bit too aggressive for a scientific talk. So again, keep things polished, simple, and professional. And then last but not least, kind of to highlight the too many plots on one slide. Again, if you're only going to talk about, say, the control performance pie chart that's in the center of this slide, there's no need to show the other 4 plots that are around it. The audience is not going to know where to look. They're going to start reading all of these other plots that aren't important to your story that you're trying to tell. So again, you don't need those. Instead, just pick that one plot that you're going to discuss and have that be the center of your slide, with large enough axes to read and any sort of main take-home messages of the figure in short text font. So with that, I want to move away from the slide content of the presentation towards the presenter. So tips for you about how you can make your presentation effective and engaging, and importantly, not lose the attention of the audience. Like many things, preparation is truly key. We prepare is totally true. For me, I always think that it's important to create a rough script, so an actual talking script of what I think I'm going to say per slide. And not only does this help you identify how you're going to craft that story arc that I mentioned previously for the content, but it also helps you identify the best ways and even the terminology that you're going to use to describe your topic. And this is important for non-native speakers too, because you need to identify what's the clearest way that you can state your research to an audience. Also in terms of preparations, because you know that you're likely going to have questions at the end of your talk, is that you can anticipate audience questions and prep answers to them. You can have your colleagues or your advisor perhaps give you potential questions so that you can come in as prepared as possible to give your presentation. And the next bullet point I can't emphasize enough, practice your talk. I often practice my scientific talks until I become bored with them because I really just want to be as prepared as possible. And practicing your talk is critical. You familiarize yourself with the material, how you're going to deliver your material, as well as how you're going to transition between slides. And it's also critical to know the timing. How long is your talk going to take? Most of us generate a presentation that's much longer than the allotted time. And it's very important to stick to your time frame, especially at a conference. So practicing your talk is vital. And then lastly, when you're getting ready to actually present your talk on the day of your presentation, you want to set the stage. Make sure that your equipment is ready, run through your slides beforehand. Sometimes it's good to visit the room before your talk. It helps you visualize what your talk is going to be like and maybe calm some of your nerves. And if you know that you're someone that needs some water, if you might have dry mouth or something like that, it's important to have water available just in case. It's also critical to present clearly in a presentation. And, that's a kind of a vague statement, but it's an umbrella statement as well. It's hard because it's not only the delivery, so how your voice actually sounds, but also the material that you're presenting and how you're presenting that material. When you give a talk, it's important to talk to the audience and not to your screen. You're probably going to be, if you're in person, standing next to the screen with the screen on your left or on the right of you. And you will need to, of course, glance at the screen to stay in line with what you want to say. But it's important to glance at the screen, remember what you're going to say, and then project yourself towards the audience. It's also important to avoid staring directly at the floor, the ceiling, or, again, the slides that I just mentioned. If you need to, you can kind of look past people and look at the back of the room, or you can look at perhaps your friends that are in the audience or your close peers and talk to them like you're explaining something to them. It's also important to speak up, make sure that you are loud enough and that your audience can hear you. We recommend that if there is a microphone, which is often the case at conferences, you should use that. And many of us are nervous. I know that I am a very nervous person when it comes to giving a talk, so there are different strategies to manage nerves. Very briefly, you can visualize yourself giving a relaxed talk to a receptive audience, so a welcoming audience. You need to breathe slowly and speak slowly, and also you want to project confidence. If a speaker isn't confident, the audience might lose interest or, just not be as engaged because you're the expert on your findings and you should be telling them, the exciting information that you're ready to present. If you don't look excited, the audience will not be as engaged. And I do have this box highlighted here at the bottom, which is specifically for non-native speakers, but really I also want to emphasize this is really for everyone. You want to choose your words wisely. So if you're not as comfortable with certain terminology, you want to select words that are not only easier to pronounce if you do have a strong accent and you're worried about that not being your accent being a barrier to your audience understanding. But sometimes words are not as difficult terminology. It's just easier for the audience to understand in general. So that's not a bad thing to be choosing simpler words to speak. It's also important for everybody to enrich our vocabulary and practice pronunciation. I know myself, I mispronounce words all the time. But it is something that will just get better with time and confidence as you give presentations. It's also important, specifically for non-native speakers, that you use visual support. So again, if you are worried that one of your key messages might not make it across to the audience, put those key phrases in text on the slides. And again, preparation is key. It's okay to prepare scripts and notes and then rehearse them over and over again. And last but not least, speak slowly. That's very important. Some people might not be able to keep up with you if you're just a fast speaker, and especially if your content is complex. And then my last point about research presentation, specifically the presenter, is that you must engage your audience. And of course, this is easier said than done. But step one is, again, to be enthusiastic and confident. Importantly, you should be smiling. This is research that you're presenting. It's an exciting time for you to be giving a talk. And it's very important for your career. So if you project confidence and enthusiasm, your audience will feel the same way and remain engaged with your presentation. If you can, throughout your presentation, kind of step out a little bit and read your audience. That's very important. And what I mean is simply checking in. Do you see that people are still paying attention? Do they look like they're confused with their facial expressions? If you do see some of that, it's okay to ask the audience if there's something that you need to clarify, and then clarify that point for them. Or if you get to the end of your introduction or the methods section or some portion of your story arc, take a breather and look at the audience and see how engaged they are with you. Again, repeat main points when necessary. I also recommend that you mind transitions between slides. If you're going between big parts of your story arc, sometimes it's hard to make that smooth transition between different parts of a presentation, and that's where you can lose a lot of your audience. So practice those transitions as part of your preparation. Again, stick to your time frame. You can always elaborate during questions, and you can always elaborate on details during questions. Questions is where you really get to showcase the knowledge that you have about your research. And then last but not least, don't drift off at the end. I've been to many conference presentations where someone gets to the end, they throw up their conclusion slide of bullet points, and they just say, I'll leave my conclusions up here and you can read them. That's not very good scientific talk etiquette. You should read your summary slide. It was important enough that you put it in there, and it's critical that you thank the audience for their attention, and of course ask for any questions if time allows. So with that, that brings us to the end of our presentation on general talk points. And Clark is going to take it from here and give us some insight on virtual presentations.
Hey, Evie. Just answering a couple of things in the chat. I'm here now. Okay, so I'll just have you cycle through if you want to go to the first one.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, I did want to make one really quick comment before, because I'll completely forget about it. So you mentioned about sometimes when you use an image as a background, you showed that what is a river type slide, which I think was a really good example. One quick thing that you can do with those, if you do like that imagery, I know a lot of people like it, particularly for like a keynote or maybe like a department talk where perhaps like you're presenting like what your research is going to be, you want it to be a little bit more exciting, and you're trying to use some visuals. If you do use images, just change the transparency to really low, and then like stuff should stand out fine and there should be no problem. So there's always ways that you can just like go through and like keep that stuff, but just pay attention to the formatting, and when you're viewing it, like, does this look good? Like that sort of litmus test. So, but yes, anyway, so on to virtual presentations, which is what we're giving now. It's pretty timely. You and I both just gave virtual talks within, larger group of people where you're trading off with the presenters, you got a moderator. So there's definitely it's a lot trickier now. One nice thing about virtual presentations, I think, is that it's relatively new, right? So you have an opportunity to stand out from the crowd, I think. Whereas standard talks, right? If you're going to attend a talk, it's been done before. There's a lot of really strong people in your field. They get up there, they deliver great talks. Usually the conference starts off with a keynote that's some sort of brilliant talk. And then you have to get up and do yours in whichever symposium, or maybe just a quick poster talk, that type of thing. So here's a new opportunity where you can sort of excel, and it's really more of an opportunity than something that should be problematic for you. So the big thing to think about is, how are they different? Because that's going to tell you, what do I need to do differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
A big thing is it's conducted on a delay. Now, it's a very small delay, but it's the same thing you get on the phone, right? So you're going to speak and someone else is going to speak, and then you say, no, you go. And they say, no, you go. So just be aware that that's going to happen and plan your interjections accordingly, right? That's going to make it a lot easier. And I'll have some more tips for this in terms of getting familiar with people on the next slide. The other thing is there's absences of audience feedback. This is really, really tough. Now here with you guys today, it's not so bad for us, right? Because like I can see you in chat, you're leaving comments, I see total participant numbers, that type of thing. So we're a little bit connected. And I think the idea of having us both on screen at the same time is helpful. So if you are in a planning session for a talk with a group, maybe suggest that everybody sort of be in at the same time, because I think that does help quite a bit. but just understand that there's no feedback, and it can be very disconcerting if you're used to giving in-person talks, right? The first time I had to do this, I had a talk that I was giving in Shanghai. So there was everybody live in the theater and me giving the talk remotely just by myself. And so it was quite difficult. Sorry, I just got a note about my audio. Is my audio okay? Is everybody hearing me? Fine. Okay. I just want to make sure it's loud enough. So just be aware that you're not going to get that type of feedback, and it can be a little disconcerting. So again, like you mentioned, this is why you're practicing. Another aspect is it's easier for organizers to adhere to those time limits that they try to set for these in-person talks, but an in-person talk, it's hard. You got you're interrupting someone live. You got to go up on the stage or signal them or something to stop them. So people just get away with going on and on. It happens all the time, and it's going to occur. But in virtual, it's a little bit easier to interject. You can leave message in chat, this type of thing. So understand that you have a better chance of actually getting cut off, right? And you may need to plan accordingly. And again, practice becomes even more important there. The other aspect is it may be recorded for on-demand use. Again, as you see that ours is recorded for on-demand use today. And when you do that, that means your message is getting shared and you're not necessarily choosing who it's getting shared with. So you may want to keep that in mind when you're giving your talk in terms of what you cover, what you leave in there, either spoken or written in terms of your work, because it is going to move on from the environment that you're presenting in, and it could be presented elsewhere, at least the recording. So if we go to the next one, I should have some tips in there. Okay, yeah, so these are some of the basics, but selecting your setup, making sure you have the right hardware. The first thing is invest in a microphone. So that's the easiest way to take a step up. The stock microphone that most people are using within their laptop or their desktop, it's fine and it works. But if you, again, there's an opportunity to really stand out when you have presenters lined up in a panel or something like that. And something as simple as your audio, which really has nothing to do with you except the effort to go out and make sure that it works well. Investing in that microphone is going to be helpful. And then in particular, your speakers and/or headphones like I'm wearing that you'll see, that can also be beneficial. So having an open mic and being able to hear what's going on, particularly in a panel discussion, is going to, again, maybe give you a little bit of a leg up, so you're not asking your moderator to repeat questions or anything like that. You don't want to be the person that's having those sort of technical issues if you can avoid it. The next thing here is plan and prepare for expected and unexpected interactions. So selecting a responsible host for the meeting, again, we're kind of defaulting to conference talks, right? And so if your conference is going virtual, and in those, whatever format you have, symposium or something, there's usually going to be a moderator or something. So make sure everybody works around that person and they get you organized and deciding what you're going to do. Because again, the transitions here have to be a little bit more well planned than everybody going up and sitting behind a table, right? And it's a little bit easier to run. This requires a little bit more planning when you're going to be doing it remotely. Outline the timeline, order, and content for the presenters. This goes into that delay thing. So know when people are going to come in and when you're going to step out. And even if you're doing a panel and you expect to have discussion, know where you're going to have, when you're going to have that discussion, at least a little bit. Some of it's going to be spontaneous and it's just going to happen, but know where you'd like to step in and make sure that person knows where you're going to want to step in just a little bit so you can make it somewhat smoother. And then finally, be aware of video functions and sort of these tricky situations that come up. So ensure you understand the audio and mute functions and you're not having to fool around with them too much. One nice thing is I think people understand that this is relatively new. And so there's some allowance for technical hiccups like that and whatnot. But again, it's a way to, if you're doing it optimally, you're probably doing better than average, which isn't the case usually in science. Everything else we have dialed in. This is something that's not dialed in. So if you really put an effort into it and are trying to do a good job in this remote environment, it's going to help a little bit. Everybody's going to look a little bit more favorably on the presentation you're about to give. Always use your video if possible. I sometimes people don't use video, and there's oftentimes reasons. Not everybody has the same access and everything, and they want to participate. And so it's understandable if you don't, but don't just choose not to because you're uncomfortable with it. Body language is really important for engagement, particularly between the speakers, because as I said, there's not this interaction with you and the audience, and you'll use your fellow speakers a little bit to create that interaction and that feedback for you to go off of. And so obviously video is super crucial for that. And then understand the chat feature, of course, if it's available, which a lot of what you'll see is going to be in Zoom, so you will have that chat feature. And then screen share function. Definitely make sure you understand this, because you're sharing content on your computer, and there's a desktop share where you're going to be showing everything, all the programs you have open and your movements around the screen. And then there's usually like an application only one, which is what you want to use for something like this, if you have like a PowerPoint, something going on like that. So just make sure you understand those, and you're not sharing things you don't want to share on your screen.
All right, thanks, Clark, for an excellent presentation about virtual talks, which is, as you say, something that we're all getting used to right now, and is a real opportunity for you as attendees to make yourself stand out. So before we get to the question and answer material, Clark and I do just have this list here of do's and don'ts to remember for scientific talks. So kind of the main take-home tips for you today. Clark, do you want to take us through them?
Yeah, absolutely. So first one, prepare. So prepare your material carefully and logically. I think we talked about take-home messages a little bit earlier. I think for this, what I've gotten from you today, AV, is that you're being audience-centric. Everything you're doing because you're thinking about your audience. And so the preparation is why that's crucial. If you don't know your audience, you kind of give a talk and everybody's like, well, this is interesting, but we're not really sure what it's all about. So prepare your material carefully and logically, particularly if it's a paper. They expect certain information to come through and to shine on each slide. So just prep that before you go into it. Make sure you practice your presentation. Again, technical issues in science are really hard. For us having a conversation right here, a familiarity with these ideas, we can talk through and have a conversation a little bit back and forth. When you're presenting your science, even your own science, it's very easy to forget data or forget context. So make sure that you're practicing your presentation well. Next, don't overload the audience with material. AV, you showed a good thing about text. Text can be important for your native speakers, right? They may not pick up on accents or dialects, or even if you don't have a very strong accent, again, if they're not a native speaker, it's a little bit difficult. Someone like me who speaks relatively quickly, people don't pick up on. And so having this text there is crucial. Obviously, make sure that you limit it, so you're not just putting up a wall of text, but select key statements that you want to include, like you did on this list for us, AV. And then avoid complex equations. This is the type of thing that they can go to the paper if they want that, right? It falls into that methods point that you made. Conclude with only a few main points. I ideally like one if you can fit it into a sentence, but if it's getting unwieldy, you can always stretch it out, but bullet pointing those and making sure they understand them is the last thing is crucial. Talk to the audience, not the screen. This is a little bit difficult. For me in particular, you have your camera up here and you're trying to look at it, but you're also trying to get that feedback, right? So I'm looking at UAV and I'm looking at the presentation. But as much as you can, talk naturally, looking out towards the audience, even though they're not there through your camera. Make sure that you're glancing up at that when possible. Try and calm your nerves, avoid distracting motions. That's important for this one because if you don't have like a stable setup, you're going to shake your camera, which I do occasionally. I might have done it this time. Also, as you move around, there's buffering and again, that delay. So it might your body language might look a little bit different in the recording versus what you would be doing live. So just make sure that as you're using that body language, that it all stays on the screen and it looks polished. And then what you have here, polish your text and visuals. So again, making sure that it's limited to the content that you want them to see. So it's not distracting, but it's there for people that maybe are having trouble following along orally. So there's a redundancy in that. Be personable, polite, professional. Again, this is something that you do for any sort of live or recorded talk. And then check your slides before you give your talk. Again, this is something you always want to do live. It may even be more important for remote because it's very hard to pause and fix things. When there's an issue at a live conference, right, you can like, they convene and you resolve it, and the audience kind of just waits. They see that something's going on. They don't see that going on when you're doing it in a recording environment like this, a virtual environment. So if you need to fix something, it's going to be a lot more awkward. So just double check everything even more carefully, particularly if you're going to be doing it remote.
All right, I think with that, we're going to welcome any questions. So again, if you do have last minute questions that you want to add to the Q&A or upvote another attendee's question, please do so now. And Clark and I are happy to answer any questions that you have regarding the presentation content today. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing so we can have a good discussion here.
Yeah, actually, can we start with a point that came up regarding the take-home message? Mm-hmm. So what are you thinking about when you do your take-home message, AV? And what do you think it looks like for when you're transitioning a manuscript to a talk specifically? So you have that original research paper that you're using as source material.
I think that you, of course, want to lean on your manuscript because you've worked so hard to, curate and cultivate that manuscript. Again, you need to set the stage for your take-home message, which is really how your work is benefiting the field. So what you did, how it benefits the field, and why it's important. And that's something that you usually set up in the introduction, which is usually the arc of an introduction in a manuscript. And then at the end, when you get to your conclusions or the last paragraph of your discussion, it's when you highlight the contributions of your work. And to me, that's kind of the main message that you want to get across. The main difference with the talk, though, is that instead of having maybe 4 contributions, maybe 1 or 2 that are the main contributions and then these secondary components, for a talk, you may only want to focus on those main 2, those primary contributions, mainly for the interest of time and for not losing your audience. So that's kind of what I think about as a main message, the contributions of your work and the importance of your work within the field and, of course, to the general public as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I just bring it up as well because, as you mentioned there, putting it up front and what happens in a manuscript is people end up reading your conclusion first, right? Mm-hmm. They want the context. They want the take-home message as context so that then when they see your methods, they can critique it, right? Everything that you do, they're coming back to the context of your take-home message. Don't be cryptic with your audience. I see students do this a lot. This is why students have trouble with manuscripts early on, I think. They want to weave the arc, right? Like it's a story, which you're doing an element of storytelling, but you want it to be clear. You're not, this isn't a mystery novel or a thriller.
Yeah, exactly.
You don't want twists and turns. So don't rely on, don't rely on the audience member paying attention every second of your presentation until you arrive at your take-home message, right? Mm-hmm. Give it to them up front. The purpose here is to communicate. You can spoil the story with your message up front in your take-home. I think it's actually a very strong tactic to use. For example, as I said here, the take-home message for this could essentially be focus on your audience, be audience-centric. Because then when I'm following your presentation, AV, and you're telling me all these things, they all make a lot of sense to me. And that's what you want it to be for your scientific talk. You want your audience, you want everything you say to make sense to them as you're saying it. And having the context of the take-home message or the major conclusions or major findings can be very, very helpful in that regard.
I agree. And one point to expand on is that in manuscripts, you probably often hear that repetition is something to be avoided, right? So space in a journal is very restricted and you shouldn't be repeating points over and over and over again in a manuscript. It's actually kind of a little bit different with a talk. Redundancy is a good thing in a talk, like relaying that main message over and over again, or starting the next section by reiterating your main point of the last section of your talk, so the audience follows along more clearly. And if they did get a little bit lost, they can play catch up because you're reiterating that main message or point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I want to get into a question here that we have that was upvoted pretty highly. So how can you read the audience, quote unquote, in a web presentation? So quick tips on what you look to try to get that feedback that's hard to get, particularly when you're in this remote web environment.
That's a very good question, a very timely question. And honestly, it's definitely difficult. It's much harder, in my opinion, to read an audience that you're not in the room with, of course. Again, you utilize the functions that you have associated with the webinar, like we've done right in the beginning. I checked to make sure that all of you could see and that you could hear me through that chat function. It's good to continually check in. And again, it's important to know your audience because it is a little bit of a black box. You don't know who is listening. You don't know how engaged they are, especially if they don't have cameras on. Like today, we can't see all of you, unfortunately, because there'll be way too many cameras for us to be looking at. But you can read body language within the camera screen. So that is something that you can use to read your audience if you are lucky enough to be able to see your audience members in a virtual talk. Clark, you have more experience with the remote component. What are your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, a big one that I always come back to is even though you can't read the audience, like for example, right now, our audience isn't participating in this so much via video or audio. So use your presenter, use like the energy from your presenter as like a pseudo audience, and that's your audience will then feed off that as well. So you can sort of create this response from your audience and read into it what you want a little bit in that regard. So use what you do have. Also, you can see here, so in our chat right now, like we have a lot of people thanking us for the presentation and whatnot. We got a bunch of questions here at the end. And so the idea is like, okay, like we want a quick hit on like all these questions as we go through, which we're not necessarily going to do very well, but that's reading the audience and trying to determine, okay, like they're ready to get into some details. They're understanding the main points of the talk. So using the chat, using your other presenters, I think that can help quite a bit. So hopefully that answers that question for you guys. Feel free to follow up on it if you want to know more information. Mateo here says, in general, I skip the slide content of the talk type thing, or maybe an outline. I suspect that that's similar type thing, and focus the beginning of the presentation to motivations. He asks, is this correct? I'm going to give my short answer and then let you either agree or disagree and give a long answer, but I would say that's fine. I like that strategy. Again, getting right into the meat, to the motivations, sets the audience up, right? As like, okay, here's the context and everything else I'm going to examine under this microscope of Mateo's motivations that he led off with. I love that strategy. So what do you think, AB?
Yeah, I agree. Again, I think every talk is different. You got to cater it again to your audience, but also to the type of talk that you're giving. So for our presentations, they're typically 45 minutes to an hour long, and I kind of always want to give the attendees a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going to be going. But if you are giving a conference talk that's only 12 minutes long or even less than that, there's no point in having an outline. People are going to know kind of where you're headed, especially with the abstract that you submitted. So it is good to really, jump right into the motivation and the importance of your work and providing that context for the audience. So yeah, I definitely agree. That's a good strategy.
Absolutely. And I think it comes because you're giving it on people understand a paper, right, as certain sections. So you don't need like to line up a content or outline. If we're discussing like multiple topics or something, the presentations you and I might give, we would give an outline. But if it's just a talk and the audience has an expected structure, you don't necessarily need to do it. Go ahead, jump right into the motivations. So great question, Mateo. And then a follow-up from him. So how do you suggest managing the transition between slides? And I'll let you follow up, AB, but the first thing I'm going to say is the transitions don't matter as long as you know them and are ready for them, right? And for example, our presentation today, AV, you put together the slides for this content, but it was easy for me to come in and handle the transitions because we have familiarity. I've seen a lot of presentations you've given, right? So again, this idea of if you're going to be in a group, if there's going to be other presenters, a moderator, get to know them, have a little coffee hour, Zoom session, a happy hour or something like that, and speak with them so you get used to going back and forth and transitioning between them speaking and you speaking. And then you get to see each other's slides and you'll start to get comfortable. But that's my thing. It doesn't matter how the transitions work. Just know your own transitions, exactly how your slides are going to go.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And that's another reason why you always want to look through your slides before you give your talk. Even though you've probably practiced it, 10 or 15 times or however long you feel like you need to, it's always good to remember how you're going to transition. So in this talk, for example, sometimes it's good to put in kind of these filler slides. And that's what I did with those slides that said, research, presentation, the content, research, presentation, the presenter. And it, again, brings the audience back to the outline that you presented in the beginning. If you don't have the luxury of, having a lot of time to have a presentation, another good way to do it is sometimes to pose a question. So say you set up that big motivation, the importance of your work, and then your transition is simply asking the audience out loud, so how do we go about this? And then the next slide you hit is the methods. So it's just having that kind of prepared transition, number one, keeps the audience engaged by asking them a question, even though they don't have to answer, and also is that really fluid transition to the next slide or the next part of your presentation.
Yeah, and so you kind of answered this next question that we had from Melvina. Can you develop more what you mean with the transition between slide? And you just explained it, AV. Simple things like, okay, let's take Matteo, for example. He has that first slide on his motivations for his work, right? So then it's very easy. At the end of that slide, you ask something like, pose a sort of rhetorical question. Okay, so this is what we want to know. Now, like, how did we find that out? And it can lead you right into your study design, your methods, and that type of thing. So that's what we mean, Melvina, by transition, just developing some way that you're not just abruptly ending a slide and then starting a new one, because when you switch to a new slide, it takes the audience member maybe like 10 seconds to like orient themselves if there's text on that slide, right? And so they sort of don't even hear what you're saying. So prepping them with like a setup rhetorical question or something for that transition, or even just starting, even if you don't do that, you just end the other slide and you go into the next one and just say, okay, so here's what I'm showing here, right? As like a lead-in sentence. So think of some way that you want to lead into it. Okay, and now moving on to the methods or something like that. That's what we mean by transitions, just a simple phrase that's going to get the audience situated on what this next slide is about to be about. That's the idea. So a question here. Best way to start a presentation. This is really difficult, right? How do you welcome the audience? There's a ton of different strategies, but what does a good strategy look like? And what's like your preferred, AV?
Man. So if I'm talking about an in-person presentation, you're most likely going to have the session convener or someone who's leading the charge introduce you. For scientific talks, oftentimes you're standing up there and the session leader is, introducing you, where you're from, what your research is, and oftentimes they present the title of your talk. So I always like to not repeat the title of my talk. It might be something that you're at home in your room and you're practicing and you're like, I'm going to present my research on this, and you state your title. But if that's already been done by the person who invited you to give the talk, there's no need to redo that again. I usually simply thank the person who invited me or the audience for listening as my open statement, and then introduce myself, say I'm happy to be here today, and then usually give a one-sentence statement of what I hope to achieve with my talk. That I'm here to present you on my PhD dissertation in Greenland about glaciers. And then I just get right into it, because it might be a little bit awkward, but people are there to hear your talk. They're here to see your findings. So I would say, don't mess around and just get down to business.
Yeah, I agree. What you can do that I think is often helpful is show your enthusiasm just a little bit. Give them a peek, particularly if you struggle with presentations and you're in a group, leverage that group. Like, you're here to have a conversation. Here's what we're covering, right? So I tend to say something along those lines, like, looking forward to having this conversation today. I'm really glad I got the opportunity to come talk to you about blank, right? Whatever your topic is. A statement like that showing that's something genuine, and so instead of something like rehearsed where you're like, I don't know what to say, other than just like getting into it, say what you feel. Like, you're excited to be there, you're excited to talk about this topic, it's something you've been working on. Nothing wrong with that sort of genuine introduction of what you'll be talking about, why you're excited to discuss it with them today. I think that type of thing can be a strong way. If you find yourself over and over having these awkward intros, give that a try.
Yeah. Another quick point on that is, if you can incorporate perhaps a figure or a like even a photograph on like the opening slide or the title slide that you have, it can be a good like segue for you. So for me as a geologist, I always used to have, you know, a beautiful photo of where I worked. And one of my introductions would be that I'm going to take the audience to that place on the planet today. Something like that, so that, you know, you're bringing them in, you're engaging them in your talk right off the bat.
Absolutely. So here's a couple like easy ones that we can get through relatively quickly. So how to present only parts of a table. And this goes to another point I wanted to make about figures. I love piecing up tables or figures into smaller increments than they would be in the study, because you don't have the same burden. This is not a peer review type thing. I mean, you are getting peer reviewed informally, post-publication style, but there's an expectation that you don't have to they need to go to your study, right? Like this isn't like, okay, I have to answer every little thing, or I have to do it perfectly right. Now, don't do something misleading, like present your results inaccurately with like lanes edited or something and like a gel. But definitely you can, to simplify and focus on like columns or bars that are pertinent to the statement you're making, go ahead and crop down those tables, those figures. So just open basically any program that can open like a JPEG or a PNG or a PDF file will allow you to crop it down, and you can get those parts of a figure or table in there. So, and then AV, there was a question. Did you say to avoid using green and red colors?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to completely avoid using those colors. For example, they're very good to highlight, you know, specific parts on graphs, or perhaps make an arrow red to highlight something that you want to showcase in a figure. I think it's just good to be mindful about any sort of audience members that might be like colorblind, for example. They might not be able to see red and green, which are some of the main colors that don't show up strongly to them. So if you have text that's written completely in red, which I don't recommend, number one, just because it's hard to read, but they wouldn't be able to really see any of that text as a result. So it's just being conscious about your audience and straying away from using too much color on your screens. Again, just use color mindfully, but you can of course use green and red in your presentation, but just probably not as text colors.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're using them for like figures and things like that, for bars or anything like that too, I would suggest maybe modifying it. This is something you can do in general for your manuscript as well. For colorblind, you can always just use patterns, right? Like cross-hatching or diagonal or something like that. That's an easy way to do it and make sure that everybody has access to what you're trying to show them. So. Okay, being a non-native speaker makes it much more difficult to be calm. Absolutely. I can't even really imagine. I mean, I sort of can, because I've had colleagues, you know, explain it to me, and I've seen their difficulties that they've gone through. But what additional suggestions, advice can you do for an audience member? So like, you have an audience watching this, and how can you make yourself more comfortable or feel more comfortable in front of them when you're presenting?
For me, and I know I said this before, it's really practicing. I think practicing also not just by yourself in a room, which is something that I do, but practicing in front of your peers and asking feedback directly from them. What part of the presentation maybe they didn't understand as well, and what part of the presentation, what sentences would be better put in text or used as a visual aid. Again, as a presenter, you can always check in, this is for everybody, not just non-native speakers, with how the audience is following along. So again, I would suggest that. Clark, what about you?
Yeah, I agree. And I'll go back to, again, to repeat a point, show your enthusiasm. So you're there to communicate, and people are going to understand that you're having trouble communicating right off the bat. They understand you're a non-native speaker, right? It's not going to be hidden. And the only difference is someone that sort of mails it in and says, I'll just read through it. The audience will be a little disappointed, not critical of you, because they know that this is like a hugely difficult task for you. And so they don't have very high expectations, but they'll feel it's a shame that language is making it so that you can't really share in the same way as comfortably as a native English speaker. And so what I like to see is someone that's just as earnest and sociable about it. Here's my research. Here's what I want to share. Like, this is the cool stuff we've been doing. This is what we were able to find. So don't lose your enthusiasm because of your nerves. When that shines through, people are excited, right? So like, they see you're having trouble, but they like want you to do well.
Yeah.
Right. So you get like the audience on your side by being enthusiastic about your research and not letting your nerves and the difficulty, and because don't get me wrong, it's incredibly difficult for you. As a non-native English speaker, I would be extremely nervous. Don't let that interfere with your energy, with your enthusiasm for your work, because if you're able to get that to still shine through, the audience is completely on your side, right? And it makes the presentation more fun for you, more fun for them, and you get your message across a lot more clearly. So that would be my suggestion.
A perfect answer. And I think that can be, in general, all of us are very nervous to give talks. I mean, Clark, you said that sometimes, conferences start off with these big keynote speakers from these, top scientists in your field, and it can be very daunting and intimidating. But in general, the audience is always, going to be on the speaker's side. They're excited to hear what you have to say. People don't sit down in front of a talk ready to, bring you down as a speaker. They're not looking to be aggressive towards you or anything like that. Every now and then there might be someone that's having a bad day that might ask a mean question, but that's not very common. So again, most of the time, 99% of the time, the audience is going to be on your side.
Okay. So let's try to get a couple more. We do have a lot of questions, but we want to try to get through at least several more. So is it necessary that slides are going to be describing introduction, methods, results, right? The exact same format of a manuscript? My quick opinion is not necessarily. It's good to have that structure because, again, scientific talks are easier because the audience knows the structure to expect, right? And so particularly if you're not doing like a content slide or something or an outline and you're just going to launch into it, go ahead and make it follow the form that they expect. But that doesn't mean you need to do those sections. You could subdivide it further and just title them like the specific element. So like an introduction is a lot, like what is the disease? What is the mechanism? And so the slides could be titled in that way. What's the hypothesis, right? There's parts of an introduction, there's parts of a methods, parts of results. You could do those parts instead of just intro, methods, discussion over and over for those sorts of titles. But I would encourage you to utilize the manuscript structure for the talk because it'll make it easier on your audience. Anything
I agree
for that?
with you, so
okay.
I don't have much to add on that one.
Perfect. How to use your hands in a virtual presentation. It's up to you. I use them a lot. AV is a little bit more tame.
I was consciously thinking about that during the presentation because I knew I was going like this a lot. So I would bring them down and then I actually felt them coming back up. So some of us talk with our hands. Honestly, I think it's okay. It's probably what you were going to be doing in the beginning or in an in-person conversation. But of course, you don't want to be grabbing things that are not, all in front of you and things like that. If you're just speaking with your hands like you normally would, I think that's completely fine. But, don't be visually looking at your phone or your device while you're giving a presentation. So the same sort of etiquette as you would for an in-person talk.
Yeah, agree 100%. It doesn't matter how you do it, but just like you mentioned in yours, don't overdo it, right? But a lot of people use that body language. So if you use it in a live talk, use it in your presentation, that's fine. Do we get a certificate of participation for the webinar? Yes, absolutely. So when you get the follow-up email within 24 hours of this, it's going to conclude. The recording has to be set up by Zoom. They'll send you a follow-up email within 24 hours. We make sure to put our link to our certificate of completion in there, so you'll be able to get that. Ways to calm your nerves. A big one for me is, again, familiarity. If you're presenting with someone else, speak with them. And that's the thing. When it's live, you have that person there. Like there's the podium and everybody's sitting up there and you can chit chat with people. You can even like talk to people in the front row of the audience, right? And say like, hey, thanks for coming, this type of thing. Talk to the people around you. You're about to enter a conversation. You're not nearly as nervous when you come into a classroom, right? With like 10 people to like talk about whatever the topic for that day is, but all of a sudden we're nervous when we go into a department seminar, which is really the same type of thing. And the reason is because it's so arbitrary. And so try to get rid of that by speaking with the people around you. If you're doing a remote talk, ask people like, hey, let's have like a little coffee hour or something to like chat about the session, just because. And you can admit like I'm a little bit nervous. I just want to like make sure, like get to know people so we're a little bit more comfortable. If somebody told me that, I would be, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's jump in and get to know each other and just have a nice convo about what we're going to be talking about in the weeks leading up to it. I think that's a great strategy. Any that stand out to you? Anything that you use, AV?
I always think that I'm way more nervous when I develop a talk by myself and I practice it a ton by myself and I I haven't done it for anybody else. And then once I give my talk to somebody else, even if it's just, you know, a single friend or my husband or somebody like that, I feel a world better, you know, having gone through it with a real audience member. And again, they're never going to be against you. They're only going to give you helpful thoughts for any changes that you need. So I think getting over that hump with that initial practice with another person will make you feel a lot less nervous for your actual presentation.
Absolutely. Couple more quick ones. So are more pictures a good idea? I think so. I love imagery. So images are good. Again, just keep in mind that the images don't interfere with clarity of what you're showing, particularly if you have text overlaid and that type of thing. But absolutely, I think imagery is crucial for a presentation. Should we include a questionnaire for the audience? The nice thing about these remotes is questionnaires are so easy to implement. So talk to the moderator of your session if you want to do something like that. But absolutely, I think any sort of more engaging element is helpful. Just bring it up to the organizer, whoever you need to talk to make it happen. But I absolutely think it's great. Or if you're just maybe you're doing a department seminar, you can just do sort of an informal hand raise sort of polling session. But absolutely, I think that's a strong engagement technique.
As do I. That's a very good idea.
How to dress up, AV? What do you think, formal or informal?
Oh, I always think formal, but you don't need to go over the top. I mean, I think it's field dependent. So, I mean, you can look at Clark and I right now. We're wearing I'm not wearing a dress. Clark's not wearing a suit and tie, but we're wearing polished clothes, professional clothes that are appropriate for what we're doing. So that's part of the whole be professional component. You do want to, you know, show the effort that you're presenting important research by, you know, taking care of yourself and being confident up there. And I think dressing up a little bit, you know, business oriented is a good move.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're seeing a lot is scientists are wearing what they would wear for department seminar, which is like their lab wear. So they're tending to wear what they work in. So it's actually a little bit less formal, I think, than it used to be. And it's just because people realize, okay, we're going to do this a lot. Like we're going to be on Zoom all the time and this type of thing. So I think you can actually take it down a notch, but just make sure, like you said, that it's still presentable. It's the type of thing you'd wear to a department meeting or something like that, even though it may not be as formal as like a conference attire or something. But that's also your own thing. In my opinion, like you want to do what's best and what's most presentable, but that's like a personal thing. And I don't think people should be like judged on it. Too much easier. It's already hard. It's super hard for non-native speakers. They're already concerned, like be comfortable.
Yeah,
and
if you're comfortable, then you're going to be confident. And that's really what's going to shine through your presentation.
Okay. And I think that's it. A couple, I'm going to kind of summarize a couple here. Presentation, how long do you equate for your slides? This varies. I know people that do like 30 slides and it's a 5-minute presentation. And I know people that do like 45-minute presentations and they have like 12 slides. So what's your format?
The general note that I indicated in this presentation is about 1 to 2 minutes per slide. And that's kind of a suggestion for like a conference talk. So if you have a 12-minute talk, you're probably going to have anywhere between, you know, 10 to 20 slides, especially if you're just, you know, showing pictures. Like I showed 3 slides in rapid succession when it was the examples of what not to put on a PowerPoint slide. And those I didn't spend 2 minutes on per. So if you're just showing photos as examples, you know, those are quick. So again, as Clark said, it's super variable. But you don't want to spend too much time on one slide because you risk boring the audience, and you don't want it to be too fast that they can't play catch up. As Clark said, audience members need, you know, a few seconds or 5 to 10 seconds to kind of acclimate with the new slide that you're presenting. So I always go for about 1 to 2 minutes per slide.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're going to go one way or the other, if you go super long, you have to be really rehearsed. Right, like a lot of slides, you have to be really, really rehearsed if you have a huge number of slides and it's really short per slide. And if you're staying on a slide, you better know what you're talking about and it better be really good because otherwise you're stuck on a slide for a really long time and it's hard for the audience to follow through with that. So ideal number of lines or bullets in a slide for like an outline? Like a max?
4, I think. It really depends on how long your bullets are. I mean, we had, you know, our checklist there at the end that had like, you know, 10 bullets or something like that with, you know, only 3 or 4 words per bullet. Again, it's variable, but you really just do not want to overcrowd your slides. I always lean towards having more slides with less text than less slides with a ton of text.
Yeah.
Just because it's more digestible for the audience.
If you have to go into 2 lines per bullet, I think you drastically reduce your number of bullets. If you can fit a bullet into a single line, you can have a longer list style, like 10, 12, whatever.
For reference, the slide presentation that we gave today was 25 slides, and that included, our introductory slides and transition slides. And our presentation before the Q&A was about 45 minutes long. So for reference, 25 might be a good indication for that.
Yeah.
For a good mark.
Okay. Unfortunately, I am going to wrap it up here, even though they're still really good questions, which doesn't have, we rarely have like every single question that we get is really good. So I would like to get to these, but I don't think we should extend it any longer because it's going to make the recording over 80 minutes. So let's cut it off here. But what we'll do is maybe look at turning this into an open forum in the future, like we've done for previous ones. So keep an eye out, guys. We have our next presentation coming up. Our next webinar is going to be with an editor for Hindawi. Do you want to quickly reference that?
Yeah, so we encourage all of you guys to join us for our October webinar, and it's going to be a very special webinar, an exclusive webinar with LetPub and Hindawi, where we're going to actually have one of their editors of their journals join us, and it's going to be an excellent opportunity for all of you to get those questions answered about how what are the best tips for getting published. And this is going to be excellent because it's not going to be from us, and while we're well versed in the industry, you're going to be able to speak directly with an editor of a journal and really get the insider knowledge about getting published quickly and effectively for your research. So come prepared with questions. It's going to be an excellent webinar, and again, we can't wait to see you there.
Yes, anytime we get these guest editors, it's huge, particularly for these Q&A sessions. Come ready with your questions, particularly as it relates to the Hindawi journals, because I think that's, as a publisher, that's a great set of journals that you, depending on your field, may be a good target for you. So, but in general, the opinions that these guest editors have for us are always super, super crucial. So make sure to show up to that one. But again, also be on the lookout. We may do a forum with this where we talk about this a little bit more because there are still questions that I'd like to get to. Also, what I'd like to point out to you is that we do have some other content on our Learning Nexus. If you go to letpub.com, go into our core, and you'll find all of our Learning Nexus articles where we do talk about giving an engaging talk. And then I also want to point back again to our sponsor, Hindawi. They have some great blog articles, and they really focus strongly on scientific communication. So again, editors coming in and telling you what they like to see. So if you are looking for more material, if we weren't able to answer your question today, go check out those resources at our Learning Nexus and at Hindawi as well, hindawi.com, because they will have some great content for you on this and other topics. So I think we're all set for today, AV, correct?
I think so.
Okay, so
again, I just wanted to thank everyone for joining us, and thank you, Clark, for your excellent insight and joining me today.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to have the follow-up email. So within 24 hours, you'll get it. If you don't get a response before then, just be patient, wait for it. You'll get our email, you'll get the webinar certificate, and you will get this full recording. So again, thanks, AV. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.